Thank you for having me here today. My paper is titled Don't Cry, Havoc, Subverting Hegemonic Masculinity in Chris Claremont's X-Men. Chris Claremont's 16-year run on Uncanny X-Men from 1975 to 1991 has been singled out for its revolutionary portrayal of female characters, with Gail Simone calling it the biggest sea change in female superheroes ever. And recent scholarship by Carolyn Coca, Joseph Dorowski, Ramsey Fawaz, and Andre Carrington have all credited Claremont for his progressive portrayal of women by the wildly low standards of his time. Even a simple Bechdel test comparison between Claremont's work and that of his Marvel contemporaries reveals a really interesting discrepancy, even if we're not the biggest fans of the Bechdel test. Claremont's portrayal of men can be read as equally important, however. So today I'm going to talk to you about Havok, aka Alex Summers. Based on my forthcoming manuscript from the University of Texas Press, I'd like to discuss the story of Havok as the tragedy of a man held to the cruel standards of hegemonic masculinity, thus forming a subversive takedown, if you will, of gender hierarchy, one that exemplifies the toxic nature of masculine ideals. Let's start with a general baseline on representations of masculinity in the Claremont run, however. The first thing to note is that his portrayal of masculinity is developed in simpatico with the portrayal of female characters, and indeed, the gender portrayal of the male characters depends quite intimately on their relationships with the compelling and powerful female characters that they fight alongside. This interplay is noted by Carol Cooper in a pair of prominent ways. In the first, Cooper observes that powerful male characters in X-Men are often willing to accept subservient roles in relationship to more powerful female characters, that these men, quote, humbly applied to be consorts of women they clearly considered superior to themselves, end quote. The other prominent effect of the X-Women upon the X-Men is more complex, relying upon the fundamental leadership role and its effect on subordinates. Quote, one unexpected side benefit of showing females as leaders is how their less impassive demeanor makes it okay for men to show emotional warmth, doubt, vulnerability, and other qualities that might otherwise be considered unproductively effeminate, end quote. This applies to both the fundamental rank system imposed on the X-Men under Storm as their team. The series shows men who weren't just taking orders from women, but who were also learning from them, and through this process allowing gender-deviant aspects of their own personality to come forward in imitation of the women inspiring them. It stands to reason, therefore, that any cohesive patterns of gender representation in this series are the product of this push and pull between the opposing extremes of the social category of gender, as they were presented in Marvel Comics at the time. And it might make sense to surface those extremes here. Consider Wolverine, a clear candidate for the most hyper-masculine figure in the history of superhero comics. But Claremont's Logan isn't actually constantly at odds with this. He doesn't want to stab you, bub. He just wants to wear a kimono and arrange parties. But the world isn't going to let him do that because he's so very good at stabbing bubs. Later writers changed this, of course. Or consider Cyclops, an alpha male leader of the team who, under Claremont, just wants to stay home and raise his family and fly airplanes. But he's so good at that alpha male leader role that it can't happen. Also, editor Jim Shooter wouldn't let it happen, so there's that. Now, Havok is actually Claremont's screw-up brother, a fun dynamic through which to explore masculinity. A little brother stuck in the alpha male's shadow. And when reading Claremont's Havok through the lens of R.W. Connell's work, we can see a clear, self-aware interrogation of hegemonic masculinity. In Masculinities, Connell explores the constructed nature of the male's sex role, identifying that, at its utmost, it perpetuates violence, leadership, rationality, emotional stoicism, and what Connell terms a, quote, taboo on free expression of emotions, especially vulnerability, end quote. Now, Connell's theories are actually much more complicated than I'm making them out to me, but this is the 10-minute presentation version. Havok doesn't align with that utmost masculinity, however. Instead, the character stands out for his innate pacifism, despite his extraordinary power, his emotional vulnerability, and for his tragic inability to live up to the masculinist superhero ideal, despite a deep longing to do so. Havok had been originally introduced to the X-Men in the 1960s, and would join shortly thereafter, before leaving the team with the arrival of the new X-Men in the aftermath of Giant-Sized X-Men #1, the point at which Chris Claremont takes over the franchise. From there, Havok was effectively retired, though he popped up in the series as an occasional guest star before returning to active duty in the mid-1980s. Havok is reintroduced in a prologue story in Uncanny X-Men 218, in which his Jeep is run off a road in New Mexico, thus interrupting his otherwise idyllic retired life with his love Lorna Dane, also a former X-Man, Polaris. Claremont immediately adds a grim portent to his pastoral portrayal through the narration, saying, quote, "It's a good life that's about to end," end quote. Of minor note here is the fact that Lorna is the driver, as we might argue that driving an open-top Jeep through the desert has a certain masculine association at the time. Claremont then establishes Havoc's reluctant use of power, superpower in this case. As he uses his plasma beams to stop a boulder from striking the incapacitated Jeep, the narration informs us that, quote, it's a gift he'd usually prefer to do without, end quote. Indeed, Havoc's extreme reluctance toward the superhero mission is a defining attribute of his character, and one that can be seen to intersect with his performance of masculinity in compelling ways. As Polaris uses her powers to right the Jeep, Havok tells her to take it easy, to which she replies, I'm not a porcelain doll, you chauvinist worm. His response is to correct her, pig, chauvinist pig. Polaris, however, corrects his correction, noting, worm buster, I like pigs. This playful exchange establishes their dynamic, but also invests in that dynamic a self-awareness of gender roles and expectations. In Uncanny X-Men 219, Havok awakes from a nightmare in their New Mexico home with his power raging out of control. He streams out of bed and out the front door, praying that the airspace above him is free of planes, before blasting his pent-up energy into the sky. The outburst is powerful enough to fuse the desert sand beneath his feet into glass. As Polaris runs to comfort him with a blanket, Alex falls into shock whilst crying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean... I try to keep under control. It's so hard. I'm so scared. It isn't fair. Why me? Why me? In this scene, Alex's relationship to power, and thus to masculinity, is dramatically rendered. He is unable to harness or even control his superpower and is instead victimized by it. As he runs off solo to save the X-Men, Claremont immediately portrays how over his head and incapable Alex is. Havok searches for the X-Men and decides to stealthily trail Magneto, who is operating as an ally of the X-Men in this time period, through sewer tunnels in order to find them. His internal monologue, delivered whilst he makes several mistakes, highlights Havok's unheroic nature. Quote, I don't want to die or even get hurt, so why do I continually put my life on the line? End quote. He then finds his way to a secret meeting of the X-Men, but accidentally blasts the X-Man rogue, nearly killing her, before sprinting away while thinking, I run for my life. End quote. From one failure to another, Claremont transitions back to Lorna, still in Mexico, and now under assault by the mutant terrorist group, the Marauders, who are, of course, taking advantage of the fact that she's alone. With that sense of Havok's further failure in play, the scene switches back to Manhattan, where we next see Havok nearly kill another X-Man, Dazzler, this time due to a lack of control again, while narrating his failure, quote, I'd give anything to call it back, but I can't, end quote. Throughout the entire issue, penciler Brett Blevins renders Havok in prone postures to help sell his timidity and incompetence. The X-Men corner him and actively contemplate murdering him in light of what he has overheard. Havok laments this. In this, he is again placed in the position of harmless prey, the notion being that if they wanted to kill him, he lacks the power to stop them. He is at the mercy of their whim. He offers to join them instead, and after consultation with Magneto, they accept. Havok struggles will continue into the next issue. During his first mission with the team in UXM 221, he is chastised by Wolverine for reacting to a mental attack. He falls to his knees screaming, Wolverine, my lord, I'm burning, it's more than I can stand. Wolverine, still standing, reflects in thought, quote, figured Havok to be cast from the same mold as his big brother Cyclops. What if I'm wrong? Suppose he can't hack it as an X-Man? End quote. The following issue, continuing the same conflict, ends with Alex weeping alone on a rooftop. These early portrayals establish Claremont's use of Havok to undermine the traditional superhero bravado, an aspect with clear connections to hegemonic masculinity. In the build-up to the Inferno storyline, Havok kindles an affair with Madeline Pryor, his brother's estranged wife, thus bringing to the surface the extent to which Havok feels that he is living in his brother's shadow in some key exchanges. His affair with Madeline is arguably a way to transgress that, but she too is playing him for a fool, it turns out. Shortly thereafter, Havok, in a daze, uses his powers to assist Storm in a battle with the airship of Nanny, a villain character. Havok is recovering from a fight at this point and fires his plasma beam in confused desperation. The result is the downing of the airship, but also of Storm, who appears to have been killed by Havok in a friendly fire incident. In the aftermath of that terrible mistake, Havok is seen drinking and sulking in the basement of the X-Men's Australian base. He directly references his self-comparison to Wolverine, asking aloud, quote, would things have ended any differently if Wolverine had been here? All this time I was so sure that in a crunch I could handle myself as good as him, maybe even better, end quote. In his anger and frustration, he blasts the TV monitor that he's watching, but he can't even succeed in that petulant act, and his blast ricochets to knock him out on the floor, preventing him from receiving the call for help from his former lover Polaris, which arrives seconds thereafter. In the following pursuit of Polaris, Havok has lost his delusions of heroism. He threatens to torture a member of the villainous Zaladain's forces for information, whilst espousing hypermasculine ideals. Psylocke, a telepath, reacts in horror at the realization that, my lord, Havok, you're serious. Havok, already emulating Wolverine's previous behavior, then uses a direct Wolverine line on the victim of his interrogation. Your choice, your funeral. This mimicry of Wolverine's voice further solidifies the portrayal of Havok within the X-Men masculinity hierarchy articulated during Claremont's tenure. Alex aspires to be Wolverine. He's just not very good at it. That Wolverine himself does not want to be Wolverine, in large part due to the collateral damage he suffers in maintaining a hypermasculine ideal, adds some potential dramatic irony to Havok's emulation of comics' hairiest Canadian. Havok's later attempted infiltration of Zaladain's fortress fails, and Havok is seen held in place whilst weeping openly again and screaming Lorna as Zaladain siphons Lorna's power in a painful spectacle. Claremont's narration describes Havok's cries as, quote, anguished, heartsick sobs, end quote. In this scene, Claremont again dramatizes Havok's symbolic emasculation. In response to a trauma, he attempts to emulate Wolverine's masculine ideals, and he fails spectacularly. Claremont juxtaposes all of this with another superpower gender reversal. Polaris' superpowers are altered in the exchange with Zaladain, granting her increased size and super strength, powers that are traditionally masculine. She puts these to use in freeing her and Havok from Zaladain's prison before aggressively planting a kiss on the helplessly dangling Havok, a kiss that plays visually on gender-swapped roles. By the next issue, it is Havok who suggests the X-Men should disband. Well, I've had it, folks. I've paid my dues. We all have, with the scars to prove it. I say the time's come to call it quits. All in total, Havok represents the portrayal of an individual who aspires to a superheroic paradigm of masculinity, the same paradigm that his brother Cyclops had to learn to distrust for the sake of his well-being, and the same paradigm that Wolverine, who Havok idolizes in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, has to consciously avoid embodying for fear of losing all humanity. Where Cyclops and Logan portray the undesirability of conformity to the masculine gender role, Havok portrays the fundamental impossibility of that same conformity, thus establishing the artifice behind the concept of hegemonic masculinity. These ideals aren't just undesirable, they're also unattainable. Alex's failure isn't just tragic, it's revelatory, and Havok can only ever be disappointed in himself, a condition that speaks allegorically to the role of hegemonic masculinity in the life of any male-identifying persons who make the mistake of attempting the impossible. That Claremont should articulate this thesis within the pages of a superhero comic, a genre known for its constructionist approach to masculinity, is especially poignant. And so it is then that when tallying the impact of Claremont's work on gender portrayals in comics, we should all do our best Julius Caesar and cry Havok as well. Thank you.